Hello world, I'm Benjamin, and this is Source Decoded. What do you think is your most precious resource as a programmer? Is it your computer? Or is it your custom handmade keyboard that you backed on Kickstarter and waited for 9 months for it to show up? Or what do you think is your limiting resource, that thing that you wish you had more of? If you had more, then it would just really unlock your ability to produce and write really good code. Is it the size of your hard drive? Or is it the amount of real estate that you have on your monitor? At least for me, I feel like my biggest constraint doesn't really have anything to do with my computer or the tools that I'm using on the computer, or even the amount of time that I have in the day. I really think that my biggest constraints are inside my own head. I really think that my limiting factor is the amount of stuff that I can hold in my brain at once. We as engineers often have different languages that we work in. We're working with different systems. We have different APIs that we have to keep track of, and it can kind of become a lot. You may have had this experience with your phone or your computer where you start to run out of memory and the whole thing just really starts to slow down. One of the reasons that happens is because the computer can't hold everything that it needs at once, it has to start moving things around. It might have to write some information to the disk and process what it has over here. And then it goes back to the disk and pulls that information off and then computes that there. When it runs low on memory, it has to use more time doing that swapping, and it can use less time actually computing the things that you want it to compute. And I think the same thing happens in our brains. If there are a lot of details and different things to keep track of, my ability to think really tanks. So today what I want to talk about is memory management for your brain. So if we think about our memory, our brains as a limited resource, obviously one of the things that we can do to maximize its use is to minimize the things that we have to put in there. And there's a lot of different ways to do that, and I'm going to talk about a few. As a programmer, you have a choice between trying to memorize everything about your programming language or the system you're working in, or learning how to really quickly find the thing that you need when you need it. Now, if you take the first option, you will probably be really fast and efficient at doing some very specific things. But realistically, how long do you think you're going to stick with that one framework that you're using right now? Or what are the odds that in a year or two, you're going to need to switch to a totally different programming language? Wouldn't it be better to develop the skills that let you jump around between different tools quickly? The skills surrounding dealing with documentation are skills that are generalizable across anything that you might have to be working on. So first off, you need to know how to read documentation. And I've noticed that it sometimes takes time to get into the documentation of a specific project, so that requires practice. I remember when I was first getting into Node.js, I found their documentation to be really difficult to read and understand. And it's not that it was badly written or poorly organized, because it really is pretty good, but it was written using paradigms that I wasn't used to thinking about. As I've worked with the technology more and more, I've found the documentation to be more and more useful, and these days I can get in and find what I need. Every project's going to have its documentation structured slightly differently, and I think you need exposure to lots of different kinds of documentation so that you can learn how to read it all. It's also really important that you be able to find stuff quickly in the documentation, and this comes down a lot to the docs that you're using. I find the Mozilla Developer Network, or MDN, to be the best source of documentation around web technologies. Most of my Google searches start with MDN because I want to go straight to the Mozilla documentation because I prefer it over other options that are out there. There's another part of documentation skills that I think is really important, and that is the skills of being able to write good documentation. You might not be very excited about writing documentation, but think about how much of it you consume and how important it is to you. And there's a very good chance that your most important consumer of your documentation is going to be future you. And don't you want future you to like you? You know what good documentation looks like, so study it and figure out how it's organized and how it's written, and then write your documentation that way. So it's important to know how to find, read, and write documentation. It will significantly reduce the amount of cognitive load that you have to bear while you're working. Another really useful tool for reducing your cognitive load is a good code editor. Modern code editors are designed to extend your memory. They read through the code that you've written, through the libraries that you're consuming, and a bunch of other information to try and figure out what it is you're trying to do. And they'll try to autocomplete the thought that you're working on right now. Sometimes this works really well, sometimes it doesn't work so well. When everything's working well, this is a really useful tool that saves you from having to remember what everything is called, what the types of things are, and what the order of the arguments of the functions and everything else is. Your brain has much better things to do than remember all of this stuff. So let the tool help you. If you don't use one of these modern code editors with these features because you're trying to be a real nerd and you don't think you need these newfangled luxuries of autocomplete, well, good for you. Probably technically I don't need them either, but they make me more efficient and make me better at my job, so I use them. Now, even with code completion and other smart tools in your code editor, it's important that you still are concerned with being consistent about how your code is structured and written. Most languages have an established convention of whether you should use camel case or Pascal case or kebab case or snake case or angry snake case, what things should be named where, how many arguments are allowed in a function, and sometimes even how long a line can be before it should be broken to the next one. And many teams have conventions that build on top of that. Maybe you have a coworker or a manager who's a stickler for convention and that annoys you. Well, you should be a stickler for convention too, because the point of convention is to save you from having to think about the things that are not related to the problem you're trying to solve right now. These are decisions that have been made in advance so that you don't have to make them on the fly. Not only do these conventions save you memory, but they also save you cognitive load by making it easier for you and others to read the code that you write. Okay, this recommendation is a little more concrete. Maybe you've had the pleasure of needing to use a function that had 6 parameters and you couldn't remember what order the parameters needed to be. The first thing is to not write functions that way. With a little creativity and effort, you can solve this problem, and the effort you put into it now is going to save you confusion and stress in the future. The second thing is many languages actually allow you to name parameters. And this is nice because it not only helps you remember what the parameters are and what they're for, but it removes the need to remember what order they go in at all. In JavaScript, there's a couple of new features called object destructuring and object shorthand notation that kind of help you mimic this effect, and I've started to use those a lot. Sometimes there's functions that take 4 arguments, but in certain cases you need to leave out the second one, like json.stringify. It feels really dirty to have to give a parameter and then remember to put in a null or an undefined and then give your second parameter. So just avoid that in the first place by giving your parameters names. Now, maybe your language doesn't let you do this, and if that's the case and you really need 4 or 5 or more parameters, consider wrapping these parameters up into an object itself. Write a new class if you have to. Not only does this turn 6 parameters into just 1, it gives them names, so they're just easier to deal with anyway. The extra effort it takes to write a class to receive these parameters pays off with self-documenting code and less things that you have to hold in your brain. Okay, my last piece of advice is to practice. I have a theory that there's a concept in sports and in music and other arts of muscle memory, which may or may not exist, but the idea is that if you do something enough, eventually you can do it without thinking about it. Now, I have a theory that things in your brain are pretty much all the same size. What matters is not the size of the thing, but the number of things that you have to be working with at any given time. If you work with 6 things in the same way over and over again, eventually you're going to be able to consolidate those 6 things into just one and think of it as one thing. When that happens, you've freed up room for 5 other things in your working memory. This is what I think happens when you're climbing the learning curve of a new language or tool or technology or skill of any kind. When you first start out, you're concerned with the little details of how everything is done. But with practice, those details become almost subconscious, and it frees you up to think about other things. Say you're learning Python for the first time. You may know what a class is from working with other languages or from school, but in Python, a class is defined differently than it is in many other languages. So when you write a class, you're having to think about all of the little details of the syntax that it takes. what's the keyword and where does the colon go and what is the self parameter for a function for, and what about all that indentation stuff. With practice, though, all of those syntactic details go away, and you're free to think about a class as just one thing, a class. And now you can think about how classes come together and make new and interesting things. You will notice that the things you do often become automatic, and there's certain things that you don't have to go to the documentation to look for anymore. And you get to a point where you can type out your ideas faster than the code completion can complete your thoughts for you. And when you get to that point, the autocomplete starts to be a little bit annoying, but that is a really good problem to have. When it comes down to it, the working memory in your head really isn't that big. We have a hard time holding on to more than 6 or 7 or 8 concepts at once. So managing that memory is really important. Don't do things that make your job harder by making yourself remember more things that are absolutely necessary. Use conventions, let the tools remember things for you, and write your code in such a way that it describes to you how it should be used. Do you have other suggestions or strategies for how you manage your cognitive load? Leave a comment and let's talk about it. That's all for now. You'll see me next time.